Hi, my name is Jeff Dixon and welcome to the Elvis Conspiracy. As you can see, we're in front of the gates of Graceland. Graceland is the famous home of Elvis Presley. It is in the top two of the most famous homes in all of America. The first, the White House. Second would be Graceland. Graceland is a place that Elvis called home, and Graceland is a place that thousands of people come every year to remember the King. This particular series is called Elvis Conspiracy. And so you might be thinking, well, what are we talking about and why are we talking about it? Let me give you a little bit of history about where that comes from, because we're going to be talking in this series about the life and the death and the life, maybe, of Elvis Presley. To understand the series, though, we've got to go back just a little bit. Over 30 some odd years ago, I spent some time doing student ministry. I love doing student ministry. I ministered in a number of churches. And like many student ministers back in the days before the internet, before some of the technology that we enjoy today, even this was not available back in those days of student ministry. We didn't have cell phones, if you can believe that. But we did have something that, whether they wanted to admit it or not, people noticed. If you were checking out in the checkout lane at a supermarket, they would have a series of newspapers always to the side that would have some kind of sensational headline on them, something that would be silly, weird, and had everything to do from aliens to somebody living, somebody dying. And then, after the death of Elvis Presley, the headlines began to show up, Elvis is alive. And there were Elvis sightings. And all of a sudden, that became almost like a subculture kind of thing that people shared. As a student minister, I was always looking for a gimmick, a hook, if you will, to talk about things that would catch attention so I could then share the message of Jesus with the crowd that I was talking with. And so I devised what ended up being a 3-session series entitled Is Elvis Alive? And taught it in the local church I was in. Before I knew it, I had been invited to other churches to teach the same 3-session series, Is Elvis Alive? And again, back in the days before the internet, back in the days before YouTube, back in the days before there was a whole lot out there, the research had to be very, very different. And so I had started collecting books and magazines, but then also pictures, and was writing to people and trying to gather up information that I could use in this series. I went as far as to visiting a couple of the Elvis museums. I went as far as visiting Graceland, and I ended up talking to some of the people who knew Elvis back in the day and was posing the question to them, do you think that Elvis still might be alive? And I was using that information as part of the series. It was a little bit later that a book was released entitled Is Elvis Alive? And it seemed to ignite a firestorm as this evidence, and I would use air quotes with that, began coming out, suggesting that maybe Elvis Presley had maybe faked his own death, and he wasn't really gone at all. Maybe Elvis hadn't left the building. And it became great fun, and for me, it was an opportunity to use what was something happening in the culture, and then coming back and talking about God and Jesus and how he was the real king. Also along the way, I went to school, Southwestern Seminary, and I met Ricky Stanley, Elvis Presley's half-brother. And sat in a number of classes with Ricky, and Rick went on to become an evangelist, and of course, you know, being Elvis's half-brother, always got to tell the story of Elvis. I wrote a book about his life with Elvis. What made me notice him the very first time in class is he was wearing a red Elvis on tour jacket. And I recognized him because his hair was just as long as mine, and he just had that Elvis look with the sideburns. And so I introduced myself after class, and it started what was a friendship, an acquaintanceship, I guess, in seminary. And so I got to spend some time and ask him questions about Elvis and what it was like to live with Elvis. So taking all of that information, I put together my little Bible study, if you will, and taught it, and literally taught it all over the country. It was great fun. Time goes by. Recently, over the past year, there's been a film made about the life of Elvis. Interesting film that kind of dives into some of his background. His daughter, Lisa Marie Presley, passes away. While I was out on a book tour recently, I did an event at Graceland in the Graceland Convention Center, and actually got to tour the Walt Disney Archives while I was there. And then even more recently, there's been a couple of books that have been released, again, talking about the life of Elvis, and a book that was released talking about Elvis maybe not being dead after all once again. While I didn't think much about that, I also noticed that Fox News released a series entitled "Is Elvis Alive?" with a big question mark behind it, where they explored some of the evidence that was out there. It had been a long time, 30 some odd years, since I went down that rabbit hole of conspiracy. And it had been a long time since I had really looked seriously at any of the evidence that I had had back then. And then new evidence has come along now. And again, I still use air quotes on evidence. And so that is the background for this series, to look into the Elvis conspiracy. So here's what I promise you. If you believe that Elvis Presley is still alive, you're going to love what I have to say. If you believe he's dead, and the people who think that he's not are conspiracy nuts, you're going to love what I have to say. If you're someone who's not sure and you're on the fence, and by the way, nearly 70+% of Americans believe that Elvis Presley could still be alive. And at the time of this recording, that would put him in his 80s. You find yourself in that middle of the road group. You say, that number's crazy. Well, hey, we live in a day and age where anything can happen, right? And so we're going to travel down that rabbit hole. We're going to go back in time, and here's what I can promise you. Although this series is beginning and we're going to cover a lot of territory and there's a lot of information we're going to send your way, by the time we are done, we're going to introduce a brand new theory into the mix, a theory that you probably have never heard before, that is well researched and well documented, because before we started this, I did take my time to go back and look again at the stuff that was out there. And I think that you're going to be entertained. And I think I've got some good news for you at the end of it all. And so, that's the background. Here we are. We're getting ready to open those Elvis files and take a look at the Elvis conspiracy. And we'll do that in our next episode.